Hello, this is the Demographics Decoded podcast with me, demographer Simon Küstenmacher.
And me, Michael Yardney, property and wealth creation expert. And this is the podcast where we unveil the trends shaping our futures. Now, have you ever worried how our housing market is shaping our most personal life choices? Look, I recently read an article in The Conversation, and I'll leave a link to it in the show notes, that suggested that soaring house prices might not just be locking people out of home ownership. That's what a lot's talking about. In fact, they may actually be locking people into marriages. Simon, this is an interesting study, wasn't it?
It really was. And it is, of course, initially a bit of a counterintuitive hook. But once you spend a bit of time thinking about it, it makes an awful lot of sense why this is yet another disadvantage of our house prices.
Yeah, well, they're locking people into marriages. The researchers found that in areas with high housing costs, couples are less likely to separate, not necessarily because they're happier, but because the financial barriers to splitting up, living in two households, are just too high. So in a way, our housing markets are reshaping family dynamics, not the other way around. You and I keep talking about how demographics changes our housing markets, and it's influencing some pretty personal decisions. Simon, the article suggests rising house prices forcing people to stay in unhappy marriages. Do you really think that's happening with this cost of living?
We would argue so. So the financial economic argument is rock solid. It is that with a divorce, costs come. This is just a life event that has obvious costs associated with. There are lawyers that are being paid. Then there is, of course, the cost of a move. Just the physical act of moving costs time of work. And then, of course, you need to have another dwelling available to live in. Yes, potentially both partners downsize. Maybe one partner moves out. The family home remains as is, but so that would then, it requires the need for another dwelling. And of course, within running two separate households, even if housing was
Yes.
cheap, you still accrue more costs because there are many things that every household needs to have one of. I'm thinking of, let's say, a toaster and a internet connection. Whether you have 4 people living in a house or one, you have a toaster in there. And so if you then split it, all of a sudden you need a new toaster. That's just a couple of bucks. That's okay. The internet connection is a monthly cost of 80, 90 bucks that hits you. And otherwise you would have only needed to pay half of it. And there is more to life than internet and toast. But ultimately, this is just 2 examples of how this
Makes sense.
adds up. And of course, the rent as well. It is cheaper to live in one dwelling than to live in 2 dwellings, even if they are half the size, each of those dwellings.
Sure. So as I read the article, and as I said, I'll leave a link to it in the show notes, it explained that the rate of divorce in Australia is at the lowest level since the introduction of no-fault divorce in 1976. I thought, hey, that's good. In the 1990s recession, there was also a period of significant financial hardship for households, and the divorce rates rose over that time. So what's happening now? Why is it different?
Yes, so the argument there is whenever there's a crisis, whenever there's some big thing that can create conflict within people. We've seen a bit of a small uptick in the divorce rate during the pandemic, because in a sense, this was an unexpected event that forced people to spend a lot of time with each other. And you could argue that this potentially brought forward certain kind of lingering conflicts. And of course, it is a hyper stressful environment. You aren't sure about the fortunes of the world, about your own economic fortunes. Boom, boom, boom. These things add up. You see a bit more divorces.
I remember those days, Simon. You and I got to know each other well over Zoom, over COVID, and I used to jokingly say I got through it and I still love my wife, Pam, but I still like my wife, Pam, during that, because that was the hard bit after being so close for such a long time.
Exactly. And you see that a relationship that has a couple of cracks in it, you have more opportunities to ultimately break the relationship then in those type of environments. But there's, of course, lots of more demographic things that go into the overall, statistically speaking, falling divorce rates over the last decades. One of those big trends is, of course, that we don't get married anymore, that fewer people get married. So you could then argue that the marriages that still occur tend to be more solid, in that only the people who really, really are sure about their future partner, that they get married. So okay, maybe that softens the blow a bit. Of course, we also get married much later in life. We partner up later in life. That, of course, means that there are fewer years where you could theoretically get divorced. So that is also another trend.
Of course, when you get married in your 30s, Simon, know yourself much better than in your 20s when you think you know what you want out of life.
Exactly. You are much wiser, if you will, or you know you're more set in your ways. Your path, your future path has less uncertainty in it than your future path had a decades ago, if that
Yeah.
makes sense. And so a relationship can actually hold this a bit longer. We of course also see that couples that marry later in life usually already have quite a few years of cohabitation behind them. Like if I look at my own life, Sarah and I got married after we lived together for 14 years. So we
Wow.
already lived through a gazillion crises by the time we actually tied the knot. So we already had enough opportunities to get divorced, so to speak. Those didn't work out. We're still together. But these are the things that overall, we all live our own personal individual journeys. Statistically speaking, if you have fewer marriages later in life, after a prolonged period of cohabitation, there is less likelihood in the system to get divorced. These are in a sense, positive developments. When we talk about the housing trend, where we say just the cost of a divorce is going up, like the costs of so many things, we could say, well, that is a thing that potentially holds you in the marriage against your free will, so to speak, because they say, well, maybe we can still work it out. And of course, there is also the real thing. Maybe there is almost a certain kind of power in it, the high house prices, in a sense that you are battling a common enemy. You know that
Yes.
you are working your butts off, the two of you, because you are working long hours just to keep the mortgage payments coming and so forth. And you say, we are living through this together.
Mm.
We might not see each other at all, and whatever. And these are the couples that say we just are functioning. We're just treading water, so to speak, not to drown. But ultimately, we can be certain that in this type of economic environment that we're in at the moment, plenty of couples are doing it extremely tough just to stay
Yes.
afloat.
Well, let's understand why people get married in the first place to understand why they divorce. Economists argue that individuals marry if they expect the benefits from marriage to exceed the benefits from remaining single. So if you've been living together for a while and the love and the amor disappears a little bit, that seems to make a bit of sense.
Absolutely, and that is the discussion. So there is the excitement of finding new partners, new adventures, being carefree. The lonesome cowboy type fantasies. These are reasons to stay single. The idea of becoming a provider, living in a wonderful, stable relationship. So there are endless different stories that might convince people that a marriage is better than not being in a marriage. And ultimately, if from a cultural perspective, the Lone Ranger type narratives are stronger, you don't end up partnering up. So you then just stay single because ultimately these lifestyle choices appear more attractive to me than the marriage or family formations type narrative. So there's constantly this cultural battle of what do we want? What are the sales points for a certain kind of lifestyle? And strong, independent female narratives. I can be my own boss. I don't need a man for this or that. These narratives are strong, and so they are encouraging singledom, which means you don't end up in a marriage, which means you don't end up being divorced, so to speak.
Well, I guess if you believe that being married has more benefits than not, then you'd remain married. But I guess over time, and it's a real shame to bring down this very important relationship to economics. But if you think you're better off outside the marriage than within it, I guess that you do have to take into account the various cost constraints.
Exactly. And of course, most people don't do this in such a, methodological way when they think about their own lives. This is a gut feeling where people say something like, I can't take it anymore. I just can't stand him anymore, whatever it is. And we, of course, know through the kind of stages in a life cycle when there are make or break points in a relationship. We discussed it in the past that once you hit retirement, you see this big potential for a divorce because all of a sudden a household setup that was arranged for decades breaks, where you spend most time during the week at a job, and then you have certain kind of things that you do on the weekends or whatever, and in the evenings. So you arranged yourself around this kind of setup. You changed the setup. Both partners, one partner is at home all the time. That changes the dynamic. So there is a whole new area of conflict that can emerge. And so whenever you reach this new lifestyle stage, maybe a marriage, a birth can be a break point of a marriage as well, but all of a sudden a kid obviously changes the dynamics and the day-to-day setup. But maybe for some people that becomes very, very undesirable. They say that the costs of abandoning the family, if you will, is less than the costs of not having a certain type of freedom or whatever. These are individual choices, and people don't have a spreadsheet for this. This is just gut feeling, intuition, or whatever it is. Yeah, and we deal with this as a society, seeing those numbers go up and down.
Of course, higher house prices could offer some benefits if you separate as well. If you do it amicably, and I know there's legal costs and other things, and often a lot of it's wasted, unfortunately. But if you have a big asset that you share and split, that could actually benefit you financially.
Yes and no. Of course, you sell the house in a different scenario. You sell the house and you move into a smaller dwelling, a cheaper dwelling together, and you then have this wealth unlocked that you can spend on yourself. Yeah, maybe it works out for in the individual scenario where one partner
I'm
then
not recommending it, Simon.
That's legal asterisk. This is not financial advice. Yeah, and it's of course very hard, those ideas of how do we then stay connected, because quite often when a divorce is linked to a family, you do not actually gain that much freedom because you still want to be connected in some way or form, and so you're then not moving across the ditch to a different continent or anything. You stay relatively local because you still want some sort of connection with the children. And it reminds me of this beautiful John Cleese, the John Cleese of Monty Python fame, who I think was married 5 or 6 times. And he said in an interview that he was very, very sad when he heard this his ex-wife died because it was the wrong one. But the fourth is quite the exception. Quite often you still have a relationship with your ex through shared custody, through shared financial assets, sometimes that are still being held together or something like this. And then you do not actually gain that freedom of that person. They are still part of your life, just not in
Yes.
romantic, intimate partner type way. We of course seen that these divorces that started or that peaked in the 70s and then declined, we have now much more patchwork families. These are setups that are more common now than they were before, because the social norms that in a sense forced us into to stay in a marriage, they are gone. And so it's much easier. There are much more families with step siblings and so forth. They interact in complex fashions, and that's the norm. But that is usually linked to financial costs and financial hits, because you share assets in a less efficient way.
I was thinking as we're talking about this, is this going to affect renters differently to homeowners? It's probably easier for renters to split financially, but is it going to affect them differently socially and emotionally?
Yeah, so I'd say financially, it is easier to split if you're renting, assuming that there are other rental properties available to move into in that scenario, because ultimately the household is dissolved much faster at a lower cost. And so and this is one of the reasons why people rent, is not just that you can't afford to buy, it is also about hyper flexibility. So if you know that you might leave the country or might not leave the country, but you want to have the options open, then you might be better off renting, because it is quite easy for you then to pack your sack and move away and start afresh.
What about this locked-in effect? Does it affect the big cities, Melbourne, Brisbane, Sydney, where the house prices are higher rather than regional areas?
Well, that's what the research suggested, is that if housing, the more expensive housing is, the more we see these divorce rate to not actually increase, to have surprisingly low divorce rates. And as you said, this is likely not linked to richer people being happier per se. It is just that you just add one layer of one hurdle to getting divorced. One additional hurdle to getting divorced is entered into those markets. That leads to a couple of fewer marriages being broken up, being divorced, so to speak. And there we go. That's the numerical figures in the big cities. So I would expect country, regional areas always to have slightly higher divorce rates.
Well, as a demographer, what do you think this is going to do? What are the consequences of staying together for financial reasons? Could this maybe impact fertility rates? You know, you're not going to have a baby with somebody you're not happy with,
And
or mental health outcomes. I guess that would also be a burden.
I would say the mental health aspect is the ones that we'd see. We would then, if we had this perfect scientific experiment, we would, of course, interview people about their happiness, about their mental health, and whatever in great detail. I would then expect that people in an unhappy relationship see worse mental health than people that break up a marriage. We actually already have census data available that shows us that from a mental health perspective, nobody is happier than a married couple. That is the best thing. It makes sense. You have a partner that you
Happily
love.
married couple. Let's put an asterisk on
Yeah,
that.
yeah. We get a bit of an insight about this when we look at the other categories in the census data. So married couples, best mental health, better than singles on average. Then you look at separated couples. So these are people that are not yet formally divorced, but they live separated. That is very, very bad. Then we see divorced couples, and divorced people, they have the separation behind them. They are happier than the separated people, but not as happy as the married couple. So that to me suggests it is best to live in a happy marriage, but if your marriage isn't working, actually break it up. That is better for your mental health. This is imperfect data that we have, but so far, and I guess it kind of checks the common sense checkbox as well. If something really isn't working out and it can't be fixed through counseling or just, deep conversation with your partner, then it's best to break it off.
I remember a couple of years ago, somebody asked me a question that caught me off guard, but I actually got the answer right, I think. And he asked me, what is the most important decision you make in your life? So, Simon, let me throw that one at you. What do you think that is?
Well, so at the moment I'm thinking it might be something about marriage, but I would immediately go to kids. It's like, do I have kids or not? That's such a big
I would have gone back a step earlier than that, though, Simon. Choosing your life partner.
fair
That
enough.
was what my answer was, because that is going to affect all these other things, including whether you're going to have kids or not. So it wasn't a trick question. It was part of a conversation. And I thought, yeah, he's right. I mean, you make decisions at the time with the combination of hormones when you're young. So you don't always make those decisions logically or financially. And it is a real shame that we're today breaking down this important relationship of marriage, or just staying together, even if it's not the marriage certificate, with economics. But I guess that is a critical decision, isn't it?
And there's lots and lots of high performance coaches and career advice folks that I spoke to who say something like, we prefer athletes and we prefer workers that are in a stable relationship, because that means they, of course, have to worry about their partner, their kids, and all those things. But ultimately, there is a lot of time and energy that is spent on finding a partner or wooing a potential new partner, swiping on Tinder and whatever you do. And this is that's just, it's a distraction towards the single-mindedness of a career. And there are, of course, famous, Casanova type people who were great athletes and scientists and whatever. But I'm always surprised by all of these biographies that I read of famous world-shaping characters, how many of them ultimately were in boring, stable relationships.
Well, this Australian-based study was fascinating in some ways. Did it show that there was a gender aspect to it? For example, were women more likely to be trapped in these situations due to historical income disparity?
Yeah, so that's exactly what it is. It's that usually the lower income partner carries more risk. That means that something gets split up. Yes, okay, maybe you get half of the assets, but ultimately you have less superannuation savings, you have less earning capacity in the future. So the lower income earning partner is disadvantaged. That is traditionally speaking the woman. So far, women would have been the losers in this divorce game, so to speak. That of course changed for a while, since then heavily favored. The courts realized this, and they tried to, in the asset split up, they tried to favor women to account for this disadvantage. But there is reason to believe that maybe in about 30 years, this might flip the gender aspect, because, and we discussed it many a times here, and women are outperforming men on every level of education, from primary to secondary to tertiary education. We are now seeing that in the youngest workers, women are out earning men. So that would, to me, suggest that we will see more couples where she out earns him, and that then in a divorce, he is more disadvantaged than she if she earns more money. So the economic logic remains the same. Ultimately, the lower income earner is worse off, and there will be more couples where he is the lower income earner.
Now, I want to ask you another question about this in a moment, but maybe for those people who don't know you, what you do and what you do as part of the demographics group, maybe you could just give us a quick summary of that. And if people want to find out about what you do and help their organizations, not with marriage counseling, that's not your specialty, but with demographic trends. How do you help your clients?
Yeah, that's exactly what we do, minus the relationship advice. We look at deep demographic data that in Australia we're absolutely blessed with. We have great data available, and we can therefore match the kind of customer base of a client with the real Australian demographic setup as is right now. And we can see how they compare. We can see what kind of areas you're missing out on. We can tell you what kind of big consumer trends are just around the corner so that you hopefully adjust your behavior a bit. Or you can just listen to this podcast.
Well done. So, Simon, finally, do you think we're underestimating how much housing economics shapes our lives? Culturally, love, independence, family. There's so much talk about property in Australia and property and house prices.
Yes, it's just one yet another story where housing has a role to play in. It is not the most important thing that we decide on when we decide to stay or not to stay, but it plays a role. And we're seeing this constantly in something like foster care. We would see fewer foster children in the system if housing was much less expensive and so forth. So constantly when we do our deep research into certain kind of topics, sooner or later the housing angle pops up. And usually it is in a disadvantageous way. We would have more money for medical procedures, arguably, if we weren't stressed like crazy trying to pay off our home, trying to pay rent. That's yet another aspect. And so it trickles and trickles down the high housing costs. And so, yes, yet again, in our discussion about divorce, I'm not surprised, but still reasonably annoyed that there is a housing angle in this discussion as well.
Yes, there seems to be a housing angle in most things. So each week we speak about demographics. And if you don't currently follow or subscribe to this, wherever you're watching or listening to this, just stop for a second, click on the subscribe button. So once a week, you get the information from Simon and me. And it's not usually about marriage and relationships, even though that plays a part, but it's really about all sorts of trends that are shaping your future. And as we've heard today, housing's far more than just bricks and mortars. It is shaping our relationships, our families, and even our sense of freedom. Housing prices that are rising may be altering our society in ways we're only now just beginning to understand, whether it's delays in marriage, keeping couples together, changing how future generations form households. The intersection of housing and human behaviour is a trend worth watching. And so therefore we're going to be discussing these sort of things each week on Demographics Decoded. So again, if you've enjoyed it, click on the subscribe button, but please do Simon and me a favour. We only ask you one favour, and that is to tell somebody else about the show as well, to widen our audience so we can help others understand what's ahead for their future. Thank you, Simon. I look forward to catching up with you again next week.
Fantastic. I'll see you next week.